If you love emotional stories filled with shocking secrets, impossible choices, and unforgettable endings, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because we bring you powerful stories like this every single week. Now imagine this. A woman married a prince because she loved him, not because she wanted a crown. And that one choice, made with a full and trusting heart, would trap her inside a gilded cage for the next 20 years. Everyone believed she had the perfect life, the perfect husband, the perfect children, the perfect kingdom at her feet. But behind the palace walls, she was disappearing, piece by piece, smile by rehearsed smile, until the only way out was to die. Not really, just enough for the world to believe it. Stay with me until the end, because what happens 15 years later will shake you to your core. Her name was Isabella Hartmore, and before she was ever called queen, she was simply a schoolteacher's daughter from a small town near the northern hills, a place where the wind smelled like pine and rain, where nobody bowed to anyone, and where a girl could run barefoot through wet grass without a single camera catching her. She met Prince Julian Ashford at a charity gala she wasn't even supposed to attend. She had gone in place of her sick aunt, wearing a borrowed dress 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a safety pin hidden under the fabric. She spilled a glass of sparkling water on his shoes within the first 10 minutes of meeting him, and instead of being offended, he laughed so hard that half the room turned to stare. That laugh was the beginning of everything. For 2 years, they wrote letters. Actual letters, folded and sealed, because Julian said texting felt cheap for something that mattered. Isabella kept every single one in an old wooden box her grandmother had given her, and even after she became a queen, even after the box was replaced by a vault of jewels worth more than her hometown, she kept that same wooden box hidden beneath her bed. It was the only piece of her old life the palace never confiscated, because the palace never even knew it existed. They married in a ceremony broadcast to 43 countries. Isabella remembered standing at the altar and feeling, for one single moment, that she had won some impossible lottery of love. She looked at Julian's face and thought, "This is real, this is mine, nobody can take this from me." She had no idea how wrong she was. The transformation began quietly, the way poison always does. First it was her wardrobe. A stern woman named Constance, the Queen Mother's longtime attendant, arrived at Isabella's private chambers exactly 6 days after the wedding, with a rack of clothes and a clipboard. "The palace has style requirements," Constance said, not looking up from her notes. "Your Majesty's former wardrobe does not align with the image the crown wishes to project." Isabella laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke, a hazing ritual new royals had to endure. But when she reached for her favorite green sweater, the one Julian had once said made her eyes look like the ocean, Constance gently but firmly took it from her hands and placed it in a box marked for storage. Isabella never saw that sweater again. Then came her schedule. Every hour of her day, mapped out months in advance by a committee she never met. Breakfast at 7, photographed for the morning bulletin. A walk through the Eastern Garden at 9, timed precisely for the changing of the guard so the footage would look coordinated. Meetings with charity boards she had no real say in choosing. Lunch with visiting dignitaries whose names she was given only 20 minutes beforehand. By the time she reached her own bed at night, she realized she hadn't made a single decision of her own all day, not even what she ate for breakfast. She told herself it would get easier. She told herself Julian would fix it once he understood. But Julian was drowning in his own version of the same ocean. His father, King Edmund, had ruled with a fist wrapped in velvet gloves, and he expected his son to inherit not just the throne, but the exact same posture of control. When Isabella finally worked up the courage to tell Julian how suffocated she felt, he took her hands and said something she would replay in her mind for the next 20 years. "I know it's hard, my love, but this is bigger than us now. The kingdom needs to see a queen who is composed, elegant, untouchable. If you show even one crack, the tabloids will tear you apart, and it will hurt our family for generations. Please, just a little longer, just until things settle." Things never settled. When their first child, Prince Theodore, was born, Isabella believed motherhood would finally be something the palace couldn't script. She was wrong again. A team of royal nannies took the baby within hours of the birth, citing security protocols and the king's need to maintain public appearances of stability. Isabella was allowed supervised visits, twice a day, always with at least one attendant present, always timed to fit the palace's schedule rather than the baby's needs. She remembers standing outside the nursery door one night, hearing her own son cry, and being told by a guard, gently but immovably, that visiting hours had ended for the day. She sank down against the marble wall and wept silently, because even her grief had to be quiet. Even her grief could be photographed. There was one afternoon, when Theodore was barely 18 months old, that Isabella still thought about years later, long after everything had changed. She had bribed a junior nanny, a young woman named Ruth who still remembered what it felt like to be homesick and unseen, with nothing more than a promise of kindness, to let her steal 45 unscheduled minutes with her son in the palace's smallest, least used garden. She remembered sitting on the cool grass in a dress that would surely wrinkle beyond repair, letting Theodore pull fistfuls of clover and press them into her palm, laughing so hard and so freely that her stomach ached from it, a laugh that felt nothing like the practiced version she gave to cameras. When the 45 minutes ended and the head nanny arrived, stern and apologetic to no one but the schedule itself, Isabella carried the memory of that stolen half-hour with her for years, replaying it during state dinners and diplomatic receptions like a secret she kept warm inside her chest. It was moments like these, rare and stolen, that made the rest of her life bearable, and also, cruelly, made it so much harder to endure. Because now she knew exactly what she was missing. She knew what her son's laugh sounded like when it was real and unscripted, and she knew that most days, she would not be there to hear it. By the time their second child, Princess Aurelia, was born 4 years later, Isabella had learned to perform. She smiled at the correct angle for cameras. She waved with the correct rotation of her wrist. She spoke in soft, measured tones that revealed nothing. The tabloids called her the perfect queen, elegant and untouchable, a woman who makes royalty look effortless. None of them knew that behind her bedroom door, she sometimes sat on the floor of her enormous marble bathroom, running the shower so no one would hear her crying, because it was the only room in the palace without a hidden camera for security purposes, or so she had been told, though she was never entirely sure that was true. For years, this became her life, a beautiful prison with silk sheets and no exit. She tried, more than once, to speak with the palace council about stepping back from public duties, even temporarily. Each time, she was met with the same iron courtesy. The crown's approval ratings depended heavily on her popularity, they explained. Her image brought in tourism revenue estimated at hundreds of millions annually. Her charitable appearances secured funding for hospitals and schools across 3 provinces. To step away, even briefly, would be, in the words of the palace's chief strategist, a destabilizing event the monarchy cannot currently absorb. She was not a wife. She was not even fully a mother. She was an asset. There was a particular meeting, when Aurelia was still an infant, that Isabella would never forget, because it was the moment she finally understood, without any lingering doubt, exactly how the palace viewed her. She had asked, gently and reasonably, whether she might reduce her public appearances from 5 per week to 3, simply to have more time with her newborn daughter. The chief strategist, a thin, precise man named Weston Cole, who had served 3 generations of the royal family, had folded his hands on the table and explained, without a trace of malice, purely as a matter of business, that Isabella's approval rating currently sat at 78%, the highest of any royal consort in the kingdom's recorded history, and that reducing her visibility risked a measurable decline in public sentiment that could, in turn, affect everything from charitable donations to tourism revenue to the crown's standing in upcoming trade negotiations. You are, forgive the indelicate phrasing, Your Majesty, the most valuable asset this family currently possesses, Weston had said, entirely without irony, entirely without any awareness of how those words would echo inside Isabella for the rest of her life. We simply cannot afford to spend you carelessly. She had smiled at him, because smiling was what she did, and thanked him for his honesty, and walked back to her chambers, and locked the door, and sat very still on the edge of her bed for nearly 2 hours, staring at nothing at all. The only person who seemed to see the real Isabella, the girl who once spilled water on a prince's shoes and laughed until her stomach hurt, was a man named Marcus Doyle, her childhood bodyguard, who had been assigned to her personal security detail since she was 19 years old. Marcus had grown up 2 streets over from her childhood home. He remembered her before the crown, before the cameras, before the version of herself she now had to wear like armor every single day. When everyone else in the palace addressed her with rehearsed formality, Marcus was the only one who still occasionally called her Bella, quietly, when no one else was listening. It was Marcus who noticed first, the weight loss she tried to hide beneath tailored gowns, the tremor in her hands during long public events, the way she sometimes stared out palace windows for minutes at a time, completely still, as if she were somewhere else entirely. "You're disappearing," Marcus told her one evening, standing guard outside her chambers as she stared blankly into the garden below. "Not physically, somewhere else. I don't know how much longer you can keep doing this." Isabella didn't answer him that night. But something inside her had already begun to crack open. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday during what should have been an unremarkable event, a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new children's hospital wing that, tragically, had been funded largely because of a fundraiser bearing Isabella's name. She stood at the podium, scissors in hand, smiling for the cameras, and in the middle of her prepared remarks, her vision blurred and her knees buckled. She collapsed on live national television, in front of thousands of people, and millions more watching from home. The palace called it exhaustion. The official statement described a minor fainting spell due to a busy schedule, nothing to be concerned about. Isabella was rushed, not to a public hospital, where the incident might raise uncomfortable questions, but to the palace's private medical wing, where Dr. Evelyn Hale, the royal physician, examined her behind closed doors. Dr. Hale had served the royal family for over a decade. She had delivered both of Isabella's children. She had also, quietly and without official record, begun treating Isabella for severe depression and anxiety over the previous 2 years. Medication and therapy sessions disguised on the official calendar as wellness consultations. That night, as Isabella lay in the private medical suite, staring at the ceiling, Dr. Hale sat beside her bed and asked a question that no one else in the palace had ever dared to ask. "Isabella, if you could leave all of this behind, right now, tonight, forever, would you?" Isabella turned her head slowly. Her eyes, usually so carefully composed for the public, were raw and unguarded. "Every single day," she whispered. "But there's no way out. Not for someone like me. The world would never let me go. Julian would never let me go. The only way I leave this palace is in a coffin." Dr. Hale was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that would change the course of the next 15 years. What if that were exactly what happened? The plan that formed over the following months was almost too dangerous to believe, and later, when the truth eventually surfaced, investigators would call it one of the most elaborate deceptions in the kingdom's 400-year history. But in that private medical suite, it began as nothing more than a desperate whisper between two women who understood, better than anyone, how thoroughly the crown could bury a person alive. Marcus was brought into the plan 2 weeks later, not because Isabella wanted to burden him with the risk, but because she trusted no one else with her life, both literally and figuratively. When she finally told him what she and Dr. Hale had discussed, Marcus didn't hesitate the way she expected him to. "I've watched you die a little more every single day for 6 years, he said quietly. "If this is the only way to save your life, I'll do whatever it takes. Even if it means my own career, my own freedom, ends the moment anyone finds out." The plan required patience above all else. Isabella could not simply vanish. That would trigger an immediate and exhaustive investigation, one that could easily unravel within days. Instead, they needed something the entire nation would witness, mourn, and ultimately accept without question. Something tragic enough to explain a body that would never be recovered, yet plausible enough that no one would search too deeply for answers. They settled on the annual Royal Regatta, a sailing event Isabella had participated in for the past 8 years, as part of her official duties. Always aboard the same small vessel, always along the same rocky northern coastline, where sudden storms were common, and where the currents were known to be treacherous. It was, tragically, the perfect setting for an accident. For nearly a year, the three of them built the deception in careful, invisible layers. Dr. Hale quietly arranged for a body double's worth of forensic evidence, hair samples and fabric scraps that would later be recovered from the wreckage, enough to satisfy investigators without requiring an actual body, which she explained would likely be lost to the currents regardless. a claim supported by 2 previous drowning incidents in that same stretch of coastline over the past decade. Marcus studied weather patterns for months, waiting for the exact combination of a public sailing event and an approaching storm system severe enough to explain a capsized boat, but survivable enough that Isabella herself could quietly disembark before the storm made landfall. In the final weeks before the regatta, Isabella found herself performing a strange, quiet ritual of goodbyes that no one around her recognized for what it truly was. She spent an entire afternoon in the palace library, running her fingers along the spines of books she had read during her loneliest years, memorizing the exact color of the afternoon light as it fell through the tall windows. She asked Julian, without explanation, if they could have dinner together as a family one final time before the regatta, all 4 of them at the small table in her private sitting room, rather than the enormous formal dining hall, and she watched her children eat and argue over dessert with an intensity that made Julian later remark, gently teasing, that she seemed unusually sentimental that week. She wrote 2 letters in the days before she disappeared. One to Theodore, one to Aurelia, sealed and hidden in the wooden box beneath her bed alongside Julian's old letters, meant to be found only if the worst happened, meant as a kind of insurance in case her children needed to hear, someday, that their mother had loved them enough to fight for a version of herself that could still show up for them, even from a distance. She did not yet know, writing those letters with trembling hands at 2 a.m, that it would be 15 years before either child would read them, and that when they finally did, it would not be because she had died, but because she had, in the truest sense, finally come back to life. The morning of the regatta arrived on a gray October day, the sky already bruised with clouds rolling in from the sea. Isabella remembers standing on the dock, wearing her official sailing uniform, waving to the small crowd of spectators and cameras gathered along the shore. She remembers looking back once at the palace spires rising in the distance and feeling, for the first time in years, something that almost resembled hope. She boarded the vessel with 2 crew members, both of whom, unknown to palace officials, were longtime friends of Marcus who had agreed, for reasons of personal loyalty rather than money, to help execute the final stage of the plan. 20 minutes into the voyage, once they were well beyond the sightline of shore cameras, the small boat cut its engine near a cluster of rocks known locally as the Widow's Teeth, notorious for shipwrecks throughout the region's history. What happened next would later be reconstructed by investigators almost exactly as planned. The boat, appearing to have struck submerged rocks during the sudden storm, began taking on water. A distress signal was sent. By the time rescue vessels arrived nearly 40 minutes later, delayed deliberately by weather conditions that were, in fact, entirely real and unplanned, the boat had sunk, and only the 2 crew members were recovered, both suffering from hypothermia and shock, both recounting through genuine tears how the Queen had been swept overboard by a massive wave just before the vessel capsized, how they had searched for her in the churning water until the cold nearly claimed them as well. Isabella, in reality, had already been pulled from the water minutes earlier by Marcus, waiting in a small, unmarked boat hidden behind the rocks exactly as planned, and transported quietly to a private dock nearly 10 miles down the coast, where Dr. Hale waited with dry clothes, a change of appearance, and a new identity already prepared. The search for Queen Isabella's body lasted 11 days. The entire kingdom held its breath. Candlelight vigils formed spontaneously outside the palace gates, citizens weeping openly for a woman they had only ever known through carefully curated photographs and speeches, yet somehow felt they had lost a piece of themselves in her disappearance. When the official search was called off, King Julian addressed the nation with red, swollen eyes, his voice breaking on live television as he described his wife as the truest heart this kingdom has ever known. Isabella, watching that broadcast from a small rented room nearly 200 miles away, felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, grief. A strange, twisted grief for a marriage that had once been real, for a man she had genuinely loved, even as she understood that loving him had nearly cost her everything, including her own life. The state funeral, held 3 weeks later, was the largest the kingdom had seen in over a century. An empty coffin, draped in white and gold, was carried through the capital streets, while over 2 million citizens lined the route in silence. Julian walked behind the coffin the entire way, refusing the royal carriage, insisting on walking every mile beside the woman he believed he had lost forever. He never remarried. In the years that followed, whenever royal advisors gently suggested it might be time to consider his future, he would simply say, "There is no future. There was only ever her." The people of the kingdom, moved by his devotion, came to see him not as a distant monarch, but as a man carrying an unbearable grief with quiet dignity, and his approval ratings, ironically, soared higher than they had ever been during Isabella's actual reign. Isabella built her new life in a small coastal town nearly 600 miles south of the capital, a fishing village called Marrow Bay, chosen specifically because it had no royal ties, no tourist appeal, nothing that would draw the kind of attention that had once suffocated her. She took the name Ellen Marsh, a name Dr. Hale had helped construct with painstaking care, complete with forged records that would withstand casual scrutiny. For the first time since she was 19 years old, Isabella woke up each morning without a schedule dictated by someone else. She took a job at a small bookshop owned by an elderly widow named Margaret, who never once suspected that the quiet, soft-spoken woman restocking shelves and recommending novels to customers had once stood on palace balconies, waving to crowds of thousands. She learned to cook her own meals, badly at first, burning 3 separate pots of soup in her first month alone, something that would have been unthinkable in her old life, where a private chef had prepared every dish she'd eaten for 2 decades. She learned to ride a bicycle to work when her second-hand car wouldn't start. She learned the names of her neighbors, real names attached to real people who knew nothing about her except that she made excellent tea and always remembered a good book recommendation. She grieved her children in private, in ways no one could ever fully understand. Marcus, who remained in contact through carefully arranged, untraceable channels, brought her photographs when he could, updates on Theodore's schooling, on Aurelia's growing love for horseback riding. Isabella kept these photographs in the same old wooden box that had once held Julian's letters, and some nights, she would sit on the floor of her small rented cottage and simply look at her children's faces, aging year by year in photographs she could never show anyone, grieving a version of motherhood that had been stolen from her twice, first by the palace, and then by her own impossible choice. She marked the anniversary of her death quietly each year, alone, usually with a single glass of wine and the wooden box of letters open on her lap. On the 5th anniversary, she allowed herself, for the first time, to cry not out of grief, but out of something closer to gratitude, astonished that she had survived a version of herself she once thought would kill her slowly, one scheduled smile at a time. On the 10th anniversary, Margaret, her employer at the bookshop, found her sitting on the back steps at closing time, eyes red, and simply sat beside her in silence for 20 minutes, never asking why, only offering the quiet company of someone who somehow understood grief without needing its details. She dated no one during those 15 years, not out of loyalty to a marriage that technically no longer existed in the eyes of the law once she was declared deceased, but because she had spent 20 years of her life being defined by her relationship to a man, however loving, and she was not yet ready, might never be ready, to hand that hard-won selfhood over to anyone else again. She grew close instead to the rhythms of an ordinary life, Sunday mornings at the small coastal market, evening walks along the tide line collecting sea glass she arranged in jars along her windowsill, a battered second-hand piano. She taught herself to play badly, but joyfully over the course of 3 winters. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest happiness she had ever known. Painful, yes. Lonely, at times unbearably so, but hers. Fully, completely hers. For 15 years, the deception held. If you were in Queen Isabella's position, trapped between a life of luxury that was slowly destroying you and a freedom that meant losing everything and everyone you loved, what would you have chosen? Tell us in the comments, because I think you'll be surprised how many people say they understand exactly why she did it. The unraveling began, as these things so often do, with something almost absurdly small. A young investigative journalist named Priya Chandrasekhar had spent the past 3 years working on a modest true crime podcast focused on unsolved mysteries and cold cases, the kind of niche content that earned a loyal but small following. Her most recent project had nothing to do with royalty at all. She was investigating a string of identity fraud cases along the southern coastline, following a paper trail of forged documents that had been used to help several people disappear from abusive situations over the past 2 decades. Her research led her, almost by accident, to Marrow Bay, and to a woman named Ellen Marsh, whose identity documents, upon closer inspection, contained a series of minor inconsistencies that Priya's trained eye immediately recognized as signs of professional forgery, the kind used by people escaping dangerous circumstances. Priya arrived in Marrow Bay under the guise of researching a completely unrelated story about the town's fishing industry, hoping to casually observe Ellen Marsh and determine whether she fit the pattern of the other identity fraud cases she'd uncovered. She spent several days in the bookshop, chatting with the quiet, kind woman behind the counter, growing genuinely fond of her, and almost ready to abandon the theory entirely, convinced Ellen Marsh was simply an ordinary woman with a slightly messy paper trail. Then, on her final afternoon in town, as Ellen reached up to retrieve a book from a high shelf, her scarf slipped, revealing a delicate necklace she always wore tucked beneath her clothing, a small sapphire pendant shaped like a teardrop, set in an unusual antique gold setting. Priya nearly dropped her coffee. She had seen that exact necklace before, in a photograph from nearly 2 decades earlier, a photograph of the young Queen Isabella at her engagement announcement, wearing a necklace that royal historians had specifically noted as one of a kind. Custom designed by a jeweler who had died years ago without ever revealing his design records, a piece so unique that palace archives listed it among the crown's most irreplaceable heirlooms, one that had, according to official records, been lost at sea along with the Queen herself. Priya said nothing that day. She simply thanked Ellen for the book recommendation, drove 3 hours to the nearest city with reliable internet access, and spent the entire night comparing dozens of archived photographs against the blurry picture she'd secretly taken on her phone. The resemblance was unmistakable. What followed was 8 months of the most careful, methodical investigation of Priya's young career. She knew that going public with mere suspicion could destroy an innocent woman's life, or, if she was right, could trigger a political and constitutional crisis unlike anything the kingdom had faced in generations. She approached the situation with extraordinary caution, first confirming Ellen Marsh's forged identity documents through contacts in law enforcement who owed her favors, then slowly, carefully, gathering physical evidence. The breakthrough came when Priya, posing as a health researcher conducting a voluntary community wellness study, was able to obtain a legitimate cheek swab from Ellen Marsh under the pretense of a genetic ancestry project, something Ellen agreed to almost cheerfully, having no reason to suspect any deeper motive. Priya then had to find a way to compare that sample against verified royal DNA, an almost impossible task given the extraordinary security surrounding the royal family's genetic records. It took her nearly 4 more months, and the quiet cooperation of a sympathetic former palace employee who still carried guilt over the Queen's death and who had access to archived medical records from Prince Theodore's childhood vaccinations, to finally obtain a viable comparison sample. While she waited on those results, Priya found herself returning to Marrow Bay twice more, ostensibly to continue her fishing industry article, but really because some part of her needed to see Ellen Marsh again, needed to reconcile the warm, unassuming woman who remembered every customer's favorite genre with the untouchable, marble-still queen from the archived photographs. She watched Ellen close up the shop one evening, humming softly to herself as she flipped the sign to closed, and felt a wave of guilt so strong she nearly abandoned the entire investigation. But journalism, she reminded herself, was not about protecting comfortable silences. It was about the truth, however complicated, however painful, and somewhere in that little coastal town, an entire kingdom was still grieving a woman who might not be gone at all. The results came back on a rainy Thursday evening. Priya sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the laboratory report for nearly 20 minutes before she could bring herself to read it a second time, certain she had somehow made an error. The maternal DNA match was conclusive. Ellen Marsh of Marrow Bay was, beyond any statistical doubt, the biological mother of Prince Theodore Ashford. Queen Isabella was alive. Priya did not immediately publish her findings. Understanding the magnitude of what she had uncovered, she spent nearly 3 additional weeks verifying every detail, consulting quietly with a legal advisor about the implications, and ultimately deciding that a story of this size deserved to be handled with responsibility rather than rushed for the sake of a viral headline. When she finally published her investigation, titled simply, "The Queen Who Never Died," it included careful, respectful language, an acknowledgement of the trauma that likely drove Isabella to such an extreme decision, and a direct appeal for the palace to respond rather than remain silent. The story detonated across the kingdom within hours. News networks interrupted regular programming. Social media platforms buckled under the volume of shares and comments. Citizens who had wept at Isabella's funeral 15 years earlier now found themselves staring at grainy photographs, comparing a small-town bookshop clerk to their beloved lost queen, and the resemblance, once pointed out, seemed impossible to unsee. Within 48 hours, Parliament announced an emergency inquiry. Legal scholars debated on national television whether faking one's own death constituted a crime, whether the state funeral had involved fraudulent use of public resources, whether the king himself might face questions about potential involvement, though no one yet knew for certain whether he had known the truth all along. Reporters descended on Marrow Bay within hours of the story breaking, camera crews clogging the narrow coastal roads, helicopters circling above the little bookshop where Margaret, bewildered and fiercely protective, stood in the doorway refusing to confirm or deny anything to a growing crowd of strangers, shouting questions about a woman she had known simply as her quiet, reliable employee. Isabella's neighbors, people who had shared casseroles with her during hard winters and waved to her on morning walks for 15 years, found themselves suddenly besieged by journalists offering money for any detail, any anecdote, any photograph of the woman they thought they knew. Most of them, to their enormous credit, said nothing at all, choosing loyalty to the person they had actually met over loyalty to the legend now dominating every headline in the kingdom. The palace, for the first time in 15 years, found itself completely unable to control a narrative. Isabella, watching the story break from the small television in her cottage, felt the ground shift beneath her for the second time in her life. Marcus arrived at her door within hours, his face pale, his voice urgent. "It's out," he said simply. "All of it. You need to decide, right now, what you want to do next, because in a matter of days, this entire town will be surrounded by cameras." Isabella sat in silence for a long moment, looking around the small, humble cottage that had been her entire world for 15 years, the bookshelves she had organized herself, the mismatched furniture she had chosen with her own money, earned through her own labor, the framed photograph of her children she kept hidden in a drawer, the only tangible proof of the family she had sacrificed everything to protect from a distance. "I'm done hiding," she finally said. "Whatever happens next, I want it to happen with my own voice, not someone else's version of my story." The first person Isabella called, before contacting any lawyer or official, before even considering how to face the wave of public scrutiny about to crash over her life, was Julian. Their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Isabella never publicly revealed everything that was said during that call, but Marcus, who was present in the room, later confirmed that both of them wept, that Julian repeated she lived, gestures of love directed toward the world she now inhabited, a way of caring for her from a distance she could never breach. When Julian addressed the nation 3 days later, standing alone at a podium without a single prepared statement from palace advisors, his voice shook as he confirmed publicly what Isabella had told him privately he was free to share. "My wife did not die in that accident," he said, his eyes visibly wet, his hands gripping the podium tightly. "She made an impossible choice, one I did not fully understand until years after the fact, to save her own life from a system, a tradition, an institution that had slowly been destroying her for years, in ways none of us were willing to see or acknowledge at the time. I have spent the last decade living with the knowledge that the woman I love most in this world was alive and unable to tell a single soul, because I promised to protect the peace she had finally found. I do not ask the kingdom to forgive her. I ask only that you try to understand her, because I loved her enough, in the end, to let her go. And that is not a weakness. That is the truest love I have ever known." The nation's reaction was, unexpectedly, not the outrage Parliament had anticipated, but an overwhelming wave of empathy. Citizens who had once known Isabella only as an untouchable, elegant symbol now saw, for the first time, the exhausted, suffering woman behind the crown. Op-eds flooded newspapers debating the mental health toll of royal life. Mental health organizations reported record numbers of people reaching out for support, citing Isabella's story as the reason they finally decided to seek help for their own hidden struggles. Parliament's investigation, after months of hearings, ultimately concluded that while Isabella's deception had technically violated several statutes regarding fraud and misuse of state resources, prosecuting a woman who had suffered such severe and prolonged psychological distress, and who had harmed no one but herself in the process, served no meaningful public interest. She was granted what the courts called extraordinary clemency in recognition of documented and sustained psychological harm, a landmark ruling that legal scholars still study today. The royal family formally, and separately, offered Isabella the opportunity to return to palace life, to reclaim her title, her position, her place beside her now-adult children, who had grown up believing their mother was dead, and who now, understandably, carried an overwhelming mixture of grief, anger, and desperate hope at the possibility of knowing her again. In the weeks between the public confirmation and that first private meeting, Isabella found herself terrified in a way that surprised her, more afraid than she had been on the day she disappeared into the cold northern sea. She had spent 15 years imagining this reunion in 1,000 different versions, some tender, some furious, and she had no way of knowing which version her children, now fully grown strangers in many ways, would bring through her door. Marcus, ever steady, drove her to the private estate where the meeting had been arranged, and in the car, he reached over and squeezed her hand once, the same gesture he had used to comfort a frightened 19-year-old girl decades earlier, before either of them had any idea what their lives would become. Isabella met with both of her children privately for the first time in 15 years, in a quiet room away from cameras, away from palace protocol, away from anyone's script but her own heart. Theodore, now a grown man of 26, wept in his mother's arms for nearly 20 minutes before either of them could speak a single word. Aurelia, 22 years old, initially stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by anger she hadn't expected to feel, before finally crossing the room and collapsing into an embrace 15 years in the making. But when it came to the crown itself, Isabella made her decision clear, and she chose to announce it publicly, in a speech watched by nearly the entire kingdom, delivered not from a palace balcony, but from the small, unassuming steps of Margaret's bookshop in Marrow Bay, standing beside the shelves she had stocked with her own 2 hands for 15 quiet years. "I want to be honest with all of you. In a way I was never permitted to be honest before," she began, her voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "For 20 years, I performed a version of happiness the world wanted to see. I smiled when I wanted to scream. I stayed silent when I wanted to beg for help. I lost pieces of myself I am still, to this day, trying to find again. Faking my death was not an act of cowardice. It was the only act of courage I had left. And I do not regret it, even knowing everything it cost me, even knowing the pain it caused people I love. Because for the first time in my adult life, I woke up every single morning as myself, and not as a performance." She paused, looking directly into the camera, her eyes clear and unwavering. "A crown may give someone power, but it cannot give them peace. The happiest day of my life was the day the world believed I had died." The speech, later translated into over 30 languages, became one of the most widely shared moments in the kingdom's modern history. Mental health advocates cited it for years afterward. Isabella declined every offer to reclaim her royal title, choosing instead to remain Ellen Marsh, at least in the quiet corners of her own life, while gradually, carefully, rebuilding a relationship with her children on terms that finally belonged to her alone. She and Julian never remarried, but they built something neither of them had words for at first, a friendship forged from 20 years of complicated love, occasional visits, long conversations on the porch of her small cottage as the sun set over Marrow Bay, a peace that had taken both of them nearly 2 decades, and one impossible deception to finally, truly find. And somewhere along that quiet coastline, in a small bookshop that smelled of old pages and sea salt, a woman who had once been buried beneath the weight of a crown finally, fully, belonged to no one but herself. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. If this story moved you the way it moved me while writing it, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose yourself. And tell us in the comments, what part of Isabella's story touched you the most? But sometimes the greatest battle isn't inside a palace. Sometimes it begins in a courtroom. Imagine sitting through a divorce hearing while everyone around you laughs quietly behind their hands, certain you've lost absolutely everything: your home, your marriage, your dignity, your future. Only for the judge to unseal a set of documents no one in that courtroom expected to see, revealing a hidden $5 billion family trust that changes every single life in that room in an instant. That unbelievable story is coming next, and trust me, You will not want to miss a single second of it. Subscribe now so you're the first to know the moment it goes live.